In 1763, a single man united 24 nations against the British Empire. His name was Pontiac. He was an Ottawa chief, and he nearly drove the British out of North America forever, while the American Revolution gets all the attention. Pontiac's rebellion was the first real threat to British rule in America. It involved more Native American warriors than any other conflict in colonial history. It captured half of all British forts in the interior, and it proved that the British Empire was not invincible. This is the story of the war Britain tried to forget, and the man who almost changed everything. Before Pontiac, there was Neeland. He was a Delaware holy man, and he had a vision. In that vision, he spoke with the Master of Life. The Master of Life told him that the Native Americans had lost their way. They had adopted European tools. They had traded for European goods. They had forgotten their traditions, and the Master of Life had a message: return to your old ways. Reject the white man's society. Drive the Europeans from your land. Neeland's words spread like wildfire through the Ohio Valley and Great Lakes tribes. He drew a map showing the path to the afterlife, and he warned that Europeans blocked that path. His message was spiritual, and it was political, and it was exactly what Pontiac needed to hear. Pontiac was not just a warrior, he was a diplomat, he was a strategist, and he was a unifier. Born into the Ottawa Nation around 1720, he had grown up during the French and Indian War. He had seen the French as allies. They had traded fairly, they had respected native customs, and they had never tried to take the land. But in 1763, the French were gone, and the British were different, very different. General Geoffrey Amherst, the new British commander, had a simple philosophy: natives were subjects, not allies, and subjects did not receive gifts. Amherst ended the French tradition of gift-giving. He reduced gunpowder supplies, he restricted trade, and he made it clear that British settlers would soon pour into the Ohio Valley. Pontiac had seen enough. He would fight, and he would win. In April 1763, Pontiac called a council on the banks of the Ecorse River near Detroit. Warriors from multiple tribes gathered around the fire. Pontiac spoke with passion and precision. He told them that the British must be destroyed. He reminded them of French friendship. He warned them of British betrayal, and he called for a unified uprising. His plan was brilliant. Each tribe would attack the nearest British fort simultaneously. They would seize weapons and supplies. They would wipe out garrisons, and they would drive the British back to the Atlantic Ocean. On May 7, 1763, Pontiac walked into Fort Detroit with 300 warriors. They carried concealed weapons under their blankets. They pretended to negotiate peace. But British Major Henry Gladwin had been warned that he was ready, and Pontiac's surprise attack failed. The siege had begun. The siege of Fort Detroit lasted 5 months. Pontiac's warriors encircled the fort. They cut off supplies. They ambushed reinforcements, and they made life miserable for the British garrison. But Gladwin held on. He was disciplined, that he was prepared, and he had enough food and ammunition to wait. In July, British Captain James Dalyell led 260 soldiers in a night attack on Pontiac's camp. Pontiac was forewarned by French settlers. He set up ambushes along Parents Creek, as the British crossed the bridge at dawn. His warriors opened fire. It was a massacre. Dalyell was killed. 60 British soldiers died. The creek ran red with blood, and it earned a new name: Bloody Run. Pontiac had won a great victory, but Detroit still held, and the war was far from over. While Pontiac besieged Detroit, his allies struck across the entire frontier. Fort Sandusky fell on May 16. The garrison was wiped out. Fort St. Joseph on May 25. Fort Miami on May 27. Fort Weatanon on June 1 SD. And Fort Michilimackinac on June 2. Indeed, at Michilimackinac, the warriors used a clever ruse. They played a game of stickball outside the fort gates. The British soldiers came out to watch. Then the warriors grabbed weapons hidden under their blankets and attacked. The fort fell in minutes. By summer, 8 British forts had been captured. Hundreds of settlers were killed. Women and children were taken captive, and the entire western frontier was in flames. The British Empire in North America was collapsing, and Pontiac was winning. General Geoffrey Amherst was desperate, and he was ruthless. In August 1763, he wrote a letter to Colonel Henry Bouquet, who was marching to relieve Fort Pitt. Could it not be contrived to send the smallpox among those disaffected tribes of Indians? Amherst asked, "We must on this occasion use every stratagem in our power to reduce them." Fort Pitt soldiers distributed blankets infected with smallpox to besieging Delaware warriors. That it was biological warfare, and it worked. The disease spread, killed thousands, and broke the siege. But the war continued. Amherst also offered bounties for native scalps, 200 pounds for Pontiac's head. He encouraged settlers to kill any Native Americans they encountered, and he showed no mercy. The British had resorted to genocide, and they still were not winning. In August 1763, Colonel Henry Bouquet marched to relieve Fort Pitt with 500 soldiers. He was ambushed near Bushy Run by Shawnee Delaware, Mingo, Huron, and Ottawa warriors. The battle lasted 2 days. Bouquet's men were surrounded, outnumbered, and running out of ammunition. But Bouquet was a brilliant tactician that he feigned retreat. His warriors pursued, and Bouquet's hidden reserves hit them from the flanks. It was a stunning reversal. The native coalition broke. Bouquet reached Fort Pitt, and the siege was lifted, but the victory was hollow. Pontiac still held Detroit. Other forts were still under siege, and the frontier was still ablaze. The British had survived, but they had not won. While Pontiac fought in the West, another horror unfolded in Pennsylvania. A vigilante group called the Paxton Boys murdered 20 peaceful Conestoga Indians who had nothing to do with the fighting. These were farmers, craftsmen, and Christians. They had lived peacefully with settlers for decades, but the Paxton Boys did not care. They broke into a workhouse and killed 14 more Conestoga women and children. Governor John Penn offered bounties for the ringleaders. Nobody was arrested. Nobody was prosecuted, and the Paxton Boys marched on Philadelphia threatening to kill more Indians. The frontier had become a killing field, and the British government in London was terrified of another costly war. They needed peace, and they needed it fast. In 1764, Sir William Johnson organized a massive diplomatic conference at Fort Niagara. 2,000 delegates from 24 nations gathered. Johnson was no friend to Native Americans. He was a fur trader, a rum dealer, and a land speculator. But he understood one thing. Indigenous nations held the real power in North America. That he used gifts, threats, and diplomacy. He exchanged wampum belts. He made promises. And he extended the Covenant Chain Alliance to the Western tribes. The treaty was signed on August 1st, 1764. It was not a surrender. It was a recognition that Britain could not win by force alone. But Pontiac was not there. He did not trust the British, and he was not ready to surrender. By 1766, Pontiac's alliance was crumbling. Supplies were low, some tribes had made peace, and British reinforcements kept arriving. In July 1766, Pontiac signed a treaty with William Johnson at Fort Ontario. He did not surrender, he simply agreed to stop fighting. The British called it a victory. But Pontiac had not been defeated. He had been betrayed by his own people. In 1769, Pontiac was murdered in Illinois. A Peoria warrior killed him with a tomahawk. Some said it was British conspiracy. Others said it was tribal rivalry. But many Native Americans resented Pontiac for capitulating. They saw him as a traitor who had given up the fight. The man who had united 24 nations died alone, and his death was as controversial as his life. Pontiac's rebellion is barely mentioned in most history books. It is overshadowed by the American Revolution that followed 13 years later. But it was just as important that it proved that the British Empire was vulnerable. It showed that Native American nations could unite and fight, and it forced Britain to change its entire colonial policy. The Proclamation of 1763 was a direct result of Pontiac's war. The Quebec Act of 1774 was another, and the resentment caused by both helped spark the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson never mentioned Pontiac in the Declaration of Independence, but he might as well have, because without Pontiac's rebellion there might not have been an American Revolution, and without the American Revolution there might not have been a United States. The legacy of Pontiac's rebellion is complex and contested. For Native Americans, it was a moment of unity and resistance. It showed that indigenous nations could challenge European power. and it proved that their sovereignty was real and meaningful. For the British, it was a humiliating reminder that military victory did not mean political control. For American colonists, it was an opportunity that it weakened British authority, that it created resentment against British policies, and it opened space for revolutionary ideas to grow. Pontiac himself remains a controversial figure. Some see him as a hero who fought for his people. Others see him as a failed leader who could not deliver victory. But everyone agrees on one thing, that he changed the course of American history, and his story deserves to be remembered. Pontiac's rebellion ended in 1766, but its effects lasted for centuries. The Treaty of Fort Niagara established a pattern of indigenous British diplomacy that would shape relations for generations. The Proclamation Line became a symbol of British weakness, and the frontier violence continued for decades. Native American nations would fight again in Tecumseh's War in 1812, in the Black Hawk War in 1832, and in countless smaller conflicts. The dream of a unified indigenous resistance died with Pontiac, but the struggle for native sovereignty never ended. Today, Pontiac is remembered with mixed feelings. Some honor him as a warrior and diplomat. Others criticize him for failing to achieve his goals. But nobody can deny his impact, that he nearly destroyed the British Empire in North America. He forced a superpower to negotiate. And he proved that even the mightiest empires can be challenged by those they seek to dominate. This was Pontiac's rebellion, the war Britain forgot, and the story we are determined to remember. Subscribe for the next episode of Forgotten Origins, because history is stranger than fiction, and we are just getting started.